Hey, what's up guys, it's Bakes here and thank you for joining me for this episode of Ranked, where the year 2023 has finally come to an end and now we're moving into 2024 and I can finally put together my list of my favourite albums from the year 2023 and rank them from my least favourite to favourite. Now as usual, before I get into my actual list, I'll do a quick little recap of my complete thoughts of the year 2023 and what we got for music. And where to start? When I did this video last year for the end of 2022, I sort of spoke about how that year was a little bit underwhelming. I think I said in that video, I thought there was more quantity over quality. We got plenty of albums to listen to, but none of them really blew me away. Now, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of albums that I liked, but none of them, as I said, really floored me. This year for 2023, I thought was much better. This was probably my favourite year of music since 2018 or somewhere around that ballpark. I really enjoyed the music that we got here in 2023, at least in my opinion, and for the albums that I checked out and listened to. But yeah, I feel like it sort of stepped up in both categories. The quantity was still really high, plenty of cool albums to check out, but as I said, the quality is where I feel like this year also really shined. Another thing that I really noticed was the return of a lot of big bands and big solo artists putting out music this year. For bands, we had the Foo Fighters, Blink-182, All Time Low, Metallica, Fall Out Boy, Paramore, Pierce the Veil. For solo artists, we had Doja Cat, Pink, Olivia Rodrigo, Post Malone. They all put out albums as well. And then also a lot of artists that, are sort of more focused to me and bands that I really like. So Trophy Eyes, Waster, Bearings, they also all put out albums this year. So I really enjoyed, the return of big bands and bands that I personally like and artists as well. And before I get into my actual list, I'm going to do something that I didn't do last year. But I'm going to list some albums that I listened to through the year, but didn't like enough to actually put in my ranking. I checked them out, but they just didn't click with me. So I'm going to list them now. The order that they're in is just the order that they came out through the year. So the first one is Trustful by Pink. Tell Me I'm Alive by All Time Low, which is the one that came closest to making this list, but I just felt like overall the album was just too inconsistent. The Record by Boy Genius, 72 Seasons by Metallica, Why Would I Watch by Hot Mulligan, Starcatcher by Greta Van Fleet, Scarlet by Doja Cat, and Together in Lonesome by Youth Fountain. So there are a few albums that I checked out but just didn't enjoy enough to actually put in my ranking. But now that that's all over, let's get into my actual ranking, my list of my favourite albums from the year 2023. There is 22 albums to go through, so this list could take a little while, but hopefully you guys enjoy, and maybe, I put you on some albums that you might have missed. But starting off this list at my number 22. So starting off this list, coming in at my number 22 is the EP, The Fear of Fear by the band Spiritbox. The fact that this is the most recently released project, at least the most recently released on my list, probably plays into the fact that it's in my last spot on this ranking, just due to the fact of not having much time to listen to it and, not really a lot of time to grow on me. But I've always said Spiritbox is a band that I really do like, but I don't love, especially as much as, a lot of other people out there. It's just personal taste. But through this 6-track EP, I feel like it's just mostly fine. The best song on this album, in my opinion, is definitely Jaded. But everything else isn't necessarily bad or nothing. I just feel like is just sort of passable. It's fine. And though I feel like this band was due for an album around this year, and don't get me wrong, yes, I'm grateful to just sort of get anything. I would have loved a full-length album. They could have just, put out more variety of songs and maybe it could have hit a little bit different. A bigger album equals more songs and more songs, more opportunities for me to enjoy what they're doing. But as I said, this EP was just kind of fine. As I said, a later project released in the year, if it was a little bit earlier, could have grown on me a little bit more. But starting off this list at my number 22 is The Fear of Fear by Spiritbox. Coming in at my number 21 is the fifth studio album by Post Malone titled Austin. When this album came out, I actually heard a lot of people say that this was his best album in a long time, and I actually have to disagree because in my opinion, I find it to be his weakest out of his 5 albums to date, and if not his weakest, at least bottom 2. Before the album dropped, I feel like this was his weakest lineup of singles. Chemical was probably his most successful single. It was the one that got played by the radio stations like constantly, and it's not a terrible song, but when you compare it to his full catalogue over his 5 albums, it really isn't anything special in my opinion. To me, there wasn't much hype going into this album, and when I listened to it for the first time, my opinion didn't change too much. I think as a whole, this album is pretty consistent, but unfortunately it's consistently average. Now, don't misquote me, I'm not saying it's bad, as I said, it's just this very fine line, it just stays very mediocre for majority of the way through. When you listen to the first handful of songs, you're like, okay, this isn't too bad, there's some catchy moments, some songs that kind of stick. But then when it becomes average song after average song after average song, it wears on you and, it sort of becomes stale very fast. Which sort of gets me to my next point. This album is too long. It's a track list of 17 songs, and as I said, when majority of the songs are just kind of passable, it becomes a drag to get through very quick. Now, like I said before, I'm not saying that this album is bad. As I said, I just feel like it is quite fine. But I would really struggle, if I was putting together a list of my top 10 Post Malone songs. I don't think any song off this album would make it at all, and as I said, a lot of people gravitated to songs like Chemical and a few of the other singles, but yeah, I don't think any song here would make a top 10 of my favourite Post Malones of all time. I was a little bit nervous coming into this album beforehand anyway. I've always had this thing where if an artist or a band releases an album a year after already releasing an album, I just kind of feel like the effort is going to be rushed and sort of just thrown together, and whatever sticks, they'll put it on the CD, and I feel like that's maybe what we got here. But either way, as I said, I'm not calling this album bad, it is just very passable. So coming in at my number 21 is Austin by Post Malone. Coming in at my number 20 is the album Not Without My Ghost by the band The Amity Affliction. Now, I've said this on my channel before, but The Amity Affliction is one of my favourite bands of all time, and unfortunately I feel like they gave us an album that could possibly be the most underwhelming album of the year in my opinion. Not necessarily a bad album again, other than the 3 opening songs that I feel like are genuinely solid songs. The rest just kind of feels average, and I wouldn't go so far to say, the rest of the album is forgettable, but it's definitely not memorable, if that sort of makes sense. This album also has a fair amount of features, especially for Amity Affliction standards. They're a band with I think like 8 or 9 albums, and I can't remember before this album them ever having a single feature. I could be blanking on something that's really obvious, but this album is an album of 10 songs and 4 of them have features on them. So I don't necessarily say that's a reason why this album failed, but I thought that was interesting enough to point out. Maybe my hopes were just a little bit too high for this album. The previous full-length album that they did before this was Everyone Loves You Once You Leave Them, and I thought that was like a blazing return to form after their experimental album Misery. And Not Without My Ghost, this album here, isn't experimental. It's actually very traditional sounding to, what makes the Amity Affliction notable. But it sort of lacks flavour, if that makes any sense. At least Misery, even though I don't love that album, it was trying something different, and there were a few moments that landed. This one just feels very safe and a little bit too traditional and sort of just lacks flavour. So coming in at my number 20 is Not Without My Ghost by the Amity Affliction. The album Alone in a Crowd by Oliver Tree comes in at my number 19, And this album actually played out very similar to Post Malone's Austin, when I was listening to it. Again, this album being a little bit too long. Personally, the weakest album to date by Oliver Tree, and majority of the songs just being kind of average. But where this album is a little bit different for me is at least the songs are short and sharp, so it kind of keeps the overall runtime at least feeling somewhat better. The best songs on this album surpass the best songs on Post Malone's Austin, in my opinion. And at least there is a little bit of variety with the songs here. There are certain songs that are beat and instrumental heavy. There are songs where Oliver Tree is doing some rapping that I think actually is pretty solid, up there with his first album. And whatever word you want to use to describe the rest of the songs here. But I don't want to spend time comparing, this album to Post Malone's Austin. As I said, I just thought there were a lot of similarities after listening to them both in full for the first time. But there are moments on this album where the songs are honestly feeling kind of whiny and even to a point a little bit annoying, which is a complaint you hear a lot of the time for Oliver Tree, but has never really affected me before this album. And I know Oliver has never been described as a poet or nothing, but there were even moments where I thought the lyrics were really basic and almost at a point cringy. Like I said, at least there's variety between his styles on this album, and a lot of the songs, sort of fly by. So again, it's nothing overly impressive, it's just kind of average, but my number 19 is Alone in a Crowd by Oliver Tree. Coming in at my number 18 is the fifth studio album by the band Beartooth titled The Surface. Now I should say first of all, this is an album that I didn't really listen to much through the year. The factors being one, it was a later release in the year, and two, obviously I didn't pick up a copy of this album, and just the way that I listen to music, albums that I'm able to actually get my hands on, a physical copy, they're just ones I listen to more. It's just the way I've always listened to music. But the few times that I have heard this album in full, it wasn't too bad. Now, granted, it's not near the band's, best and highest peaks or anything, but there was a few catchy hooks and a few bangers sprinkled throughout this album. This is probably the least heaviest effort by Beartooth to date, but it is Beartooth, so take that as you will. There are still some pretty heavy songs, that you come across here. But I would say a lot of the songs, sort of have this lighter rock feel. Even the writing, a lot of that is a lot more positive and upbeat, and at points it can come across as a little bit corny, but not to the point where it's off-putting or anything. I was a little bit worried about this album going into it. The only songs that I listened to in full before the album actually came out was Sunshine, which at first I didn't really like, but it grew on me, and Riptide, which I wasn't sure was even going to make the album because it came out so long ago, but I always dug that song. But everything else I was just kind of worried about. I thought maybe Beartooth was becoming one of those bands I've been kind of drifting away from because some of their later efforts have never hit the heights of their debut album Disgusting. But by all means, this album wasn't a home run or anything, but definitely was a pleasant enough surprise. So coming in at my number 18 is The Surface by Beartooth. Coming in as my number 17 is the third album by underrated pop-punk band Bearings, titled The Best Part About Being Human. As I said, Bearings have always been a band I've found to be extremely underrated, and people that like pop-punk, I really try to put them onto this band. This album of their three to date is probably the most pop-leaning out of their pop-punk sound, but still plenty of stuff to enjoy here. I first came across this album when they released their lead single Scenery, and I was enjoying Scenery, but at the time they didn't announce anything for an album, so I sort of drifted away from that song. After a certain amount of time passed, I was like, okay, I wonder what's going on with Bearings. Maybe they released another song, and by that time they actually released the full album, so I'm like, oh, beautiful, I can just listen to it all in one sitting. And I would say at the moment it's probably the weakest out of their three albums so far, but it's also one of the more recent ones that I've actually got my hands on, and sort of just been listening to it a little bit late, so that's kind of a factor for why it's a little bit lower on this ranking, but still got room to grow on me. Their second album, Hello It's You, sort of did the same thing. It started off okay, but really shot up there for me, so this one could do the same. Gonna keep this one short and sharp. My number 17, The Best Part About Being Human by the band Bearings. Coming in at my number 16 is the album Losing What We Love by the band Knuckle Puck. I've said this on my channel before, Knuckle Puck for the longest time have been a band that I've really wanted to enjoy, but just never really had that connection with. I have listened to their previous albums, and the album that I've enjoyed the most beforehand and come actually really close to picking up is their album Copacetic, but again, just haven't really pulled the trigger on it. It was just a little bit too inconsistent, but maybe worth going back and listening to again. But this is the first album by Knuckle Puck where, from the singles to some of the back catalogue that we got here, I've enjoyed from start to finish. Kind of like the previous mentioned album by Bearings, The Best Part About Being Human, I actually picked them up in the same order. So I've been listening to this album more recently, but not so much, earlier on when it was first released. So it's sort of been growing on me. I actually originally had this at my number 17, and The Best Part About Being Human in this spot, but I swapped them over, particularly because there are a few songs here that really stand out to me, and I'm putting together my list of my favourite songs from 2023. Spoiler alert, these ones, could have been honourable mentions and could have made it, but I just feel like they're a little bit too late and there's a bit of recency biased. But songs I want to highlight is Groundhog Day, really fucking cool song, and the opening track, A New Beginning. But yeah, I'll keep this one short and sharp as well. My number 16 is Losing What We Love by Knuckle Puck. My number 15 goes to Kenny Hoopla's EP, Blink and You'll Miss It. I still stand by the theory that Kenny won't give us a full album because it's going to be too fucking good that we just won't be able to handle it. That's got to be it, because he's given us another EP, and honestly, I still feel a little bit weird about putting an EP of only 3 songs so high on my ranking. But yes, this project pretty much encapsulates what I love about pop punk and why it's one of my favourite subgenres of music. Just full of fun and energy and catchy hooks and riffs. And even for a while, I was in love with Sabotage, and then Marry, Kill, Fuck, and then T-Shirt. That was a song that I was like, yeah, no, that's okay. That shut up for me as well. And it's hard to go into deep detail on an EP that's only 3 songs, but I'm sure you guys are understanding how much I loved this effort, so I'm going to keep it short and sharp. Kenny Hoopla, please give us a full-length album, please. My number 15, Blink and You'll Miss It, EP by Kenny Hoopla. The album Calling the Dogs by the band Citizen comes in at my number 14, and this is an album I had a good time with, and it's one that's especially grown on me more as the years gone on, and it's one that's quite light. It's sort of got these dance vibes going for it and sort of these feels of the summertime, and it's quite a different sound than what my favourite Citizen sound is. My favourite Citizen album is their third album, As You Please, which, as I said, their style has changed a bit over time, and sometimes that's just what happens, bands evolve. And I do kind of wish this album had a bit more of that grit and attitude, which I know the band can pull off so well, and I believe would still work, even with an album with this sort of style. But regardless, I was enjoying what we got, so it is full of lots of underrated bangers and sort of got these fun tracks and ones that I can come back to. So coming in at my number 14 is Calling the Dogs by Citizen. This album that I have coming in at my number 13 is actually a safe bet to say is the album that grew on me the most this year, but coming in at my number 13 is Intellectual Property by Waterparks. Originally, this was an album I actually passed on. The first time I heard it, I decided, it wasn't for me. Later Waterparks albums have been a little bit inconsistent, so it wasn't the end of the world. But the story behind it was, as I said, passed on it. I went to Warner Music Australia's website to pick up some other albums, and I saw this one there, and I went, you know what? It's been a little while since I listened to Intellectual Property. I might as well give it a re-listen so I can pick it up in this order as well. And it just hit on a different level that time, and obviously I picked it up. So going from originally not having it on my list at all, it would have been in those albums that I listed at the start of this video where I listened to them but passed on. So going from that to actually making my list, even though not on the top half, is still pretty impressive. But with all that being said, this album still isn't perfect by any means. It doesn't reach the levels that I know Waterparks can reach as a band, but still enjoyable enough. There's plenty of moments on this album where it's sort of things that I haven't loved about recent Waterparks albums, where it's just too out there and too experimental, and it just doesn't connect with me, and I feel a little bit alienated, but whatever. There's still some fun pop-punk moments, songs like Funeral Grey and Sabotage, and then there's some like real gritty, heavier moments with songs like Real Super Dark and Fuck About It, but also some real basic stuff that in a way kind of works as well. To be fair, this album also has a lot of filler and just confusing shit, but it all gets balanced out with some of the more passable efforts. So I don't want to talk about this one for too much longer, else I'll just rabble on, because there's a lot to break down with this album. But coming in at my number 13 is Intellectual Property by the band Waterparks. My number 12 spot goes to the album Sunburn by Dominic Fike. I wasn't too familiar with Dominic Fike before this album. Like, I knew his song Three Nights, and his on-screen appearance in the show Euphoria, and the song that he sang in that show I kind of liked as well. But I heard this album was coming out, and that kind of piqued my interest, especially after hearing the leading singles. And when this album came out, it sort of was released to some mixed feedback. And by all means, I don't think this album is perfect either, but it's got these sort of chill summer vibes and a handful of some infectious, catchy songs that I wouldn't mind coming back to for sure. He also balances a good range of styles here, like there's some basic pop stuff, but then he's also doing some rapping and some slow acoustic stuff, while also doing some interesting instrumental led songs as well. Though I'm sure this is never going to be an album that's on heavy, frequent rotation for me, just based off the, genres that I normally gravitate to. This is very different to that. But it's definitely also potentially one of the biggest surprises of the year, again, just based off the genres that I normally listen to. But I don't know the rumours are true if Dominic Fike is an industry plant or not. Either way, I was impressed, especially for, as I said, an album that's not in my typical genres that I listen to. So I'm keen to hear more. My number 12, Sunburn by Dominic Fike. Coming in at my number 11 is the album But Here We Are by the Foo Fighters. I've said this and brought it up a couple times before on my channel. For one of the biggest bands in the world, I like the Foo Fighters, but I don't love the Foo Fighters. Before this album, I truly and genuinely believe they've never had a great album. The closest to it is The Colour and the Shape, which has 3 absolute bangers on it, being Monkey Wrench, My Hero, and Everlong. But the rest of the album isn't anything special, but as I said before, this album, it probably was my favourite. But the Foo Fighters have now given us their best album to date, and I genuinely mean that. I'm not just saying it as sympathy points for the passing of their drummer Taylor Hawkins, which is of course extremely sad and devastating. And that also adds to a lot of the emotion coming from this album through the lyrics and the writing. But besides the emotion in the songs through the writing, this is the best I've ever heard the band sound in a long time. Not all, but a good portion of this album sounds like Foo Fighters from like a decade ago, maybe even earlier, but it does also sprinkle through a little bit of their modern sound. The reception to this album has been mostly positive, which does make me feel happy. Just again, purely because of what the band has gone through as of recent times. And I'm still not a massive Foo Fighters fan. I did just go and see them live within this month, and it was a really good show. But I can say this was a really tough cut from my top 10. So coming in at my number 11 is But Here We Are by the Foo Fighters. So here we are getting into the top 10, and as I said, the Foo Fighters album But Here We Are just missed out, and it fell short to this album, my number 10, Still Love by Teenage Wrist. This is a band that I've come around on hugely, especially over the past couple of years, and I've said that before on my channel. This album hits with the grunge, the punk, the pop punk, the emo vibes that this band is known for. And even though it doesn't quite hit the peaks and the flow of their previous album, Earth is a Black Hole, I still think that that album is better than this one, but this album is still a great effort. A small critique that I have is that this album sometimes feels a little bit too long, so as it goes on it feels like it is dragging a little bit, and even in the times where it does feel like it's not dragging and doesn't feel too long, I feel like it still loses a little bit of momentum as it goes. There are still plenty of good tracks towards the back of the album, but I definitely feel like the stronger half of this album is the first half. But to keep it short and sharp and sum this one up, Teenage Wrist I still feel like is such an underrated band. As I said, they balance so many genres, more so genres that pack attitude, as I said, grunge, emo, punk, but it really works, and as I said, such an underrated band. I'm still trying to put them on a lot of people's radar, so my number 10 is the album Still Love by Teenage Wrist. Coming in at my number 9 spot is the album The Jaws of Life by the band Pierce of Ale. Originally this was an album I had ranked much lower, somewhere around like the 15-14 mark, but when I looked at the first draft of my list, I just kept thinking, yeah, I think I want to move this one up. I just kept thinking to myself, I like it more than this album, and moving it up a spot, and then going, well, I think I like it more than this one as well, and I eventually kept moving and moving till it got to my number 9. I think I originally had it at that 15-14 spot, purely from the fact that this album was kind of disappointing at first, especially the fact that it came after a 7-year wait between albums, and the album before this one is, to me, my favourite Pierce of Ale album, being Misadventures. But it's also kind of not what I expected either. The leading singles past the Nirvana and Emergency Contact sounded like the band was sort of headed in this grunge direction, which I was all for. I really liked those singles, and I was like, yeah, I think Pierce of Ale is a band that can pull that off. And not only were those two songs and maybe a couple of others the only ones that sort of went in that grunge direction, another good portion of this album was sort of this newer sound that they're trying out, sprinkled through with a little bit of their OJ sound as well. But yes, this album was kind of disappointing, but by all means not bad. This is definitely one I listened to in full a lot through the year, and I think that helps that it came out in February. But this is one that, looking back, I did mostly enjoy. As I said, take away the little bit of disappointment from it being not what I expected. Still enjoyable listen. So my number 9, The Jaws of Life by Pierce of Ale. Coming in at my number 8 is the album Suicide and Sunshine by the band Trophy Eyes. Now, a lot of the same stuff could be said as the previously mentioned The Jaws of Life by Pierce of Ale. Originally, again, this was an album that I had around the mid-range mark after my first draft of this list. Again, it was a little bit disappointing after a long wait between albums, and the album before this one was The American Dream, which was an album I loved. And on top of that, this was potentially the best lineup of 3 singles that we've had for a Trophy Eyes album. Here we had Blue Eyed Boy, What Hurts the Most, and Kill. 3 fucking great singles released in a row, and I'm like, this album could fucking hit. However, the rest of the album upon first listen was kind of meh. But what can you say? Even a weaker Trophy Eyes album still has so much stuff that I enjoyed and grew on me over time. A lot of the songs sort of have this softer, cleaner, stripped back approach, taking a bigger focus on the songwriting by John Florini and John's vocals as well. And I'm not too sure if this album has an overall joint story or stories behind this album. I really don't know. But a lot of the songs, sort of have a relating message and carry the same emotion and feels. So I'm not sure what the story is behind this album, if it's meant to be a concept album, but it kind of feels like that. The strongest thing is Trophy Eyes just have this vibe and this feel that is just unlike anything else that I really listen to. It just encapsulates in every single song, and it's impossible to deny how awesome Trophy Eyes are as a band, even though, again, this album, in grand aspect of all their albums, is kind of disappointing. I still enjoyed this one enough. So coming in at my number 8 is Suicide and Sunshine by Trophy Eyes. So as I move on to my number 7, this album sort of signals a momentum shift. Don't get me wrong, all of the previously mentioned albums I really do enjoy, but now we're getting into the albums from the year 2023 that sort of floored me. So my number 7 is Postcards from a Living Hell by the band Red Hook. Now, I finally got the chance to talk about Red Hook on my channel a little while ago, but it was sort of brief, but I'm so happy I get to talk about them again, and especially with this album, because this album was so much fucking fun. I've always said Red Hook have a little bit for everybody. They have pop punk, and then they have rock, and then they have techno and even rapping. They're sort of a more diverse, maybe not as good version of the band Stand Atlantic. So if you like the band Stand Atlantic, I don't see why you wouldn't enjoy Red Hook. It should be up your alley. But like a lot of the band's previous music that they've put out with EPs and everything, this album delivered with the fun, and I was so happy that it did. I was slightly nervous about this album as it was leading up to its release, just purely because it's the band's first full-length album. It's their debut full-length, and I was a little bit nervous that they were going to fumble the bag and everything, but as I said, not only did they deliver the fun and everything, it really fucking surprised me with how much I genuinely enjoyed it. Now, this is an album that I listened to lots at the start of the year. I think it came around in April or something like that, and I listened to it a ton, but sort of through the mid part of the year, it was one I sort of skipped out on. But when I was coming back to re-listen to albums for this ranking, I was like, yeah, this one could be fun. I remember it being pretty good, but maybe the glitter's worn out a little bit. But no, still fucking rocks, and as I said, it just kept shooting up this ranking. By all means, it's not the best album of the year, but it's definitely up there for the most fun and most surprising. And I've spoken about on my channel before cheeseburger and fast food albums, and what that means is maybe an album that, if you look at it under a microscope and what it actually is, it's maybe not the best, and listening to it too much might make you a little bit sick and burnt out, but fuck, it's a really fucking good cheeseburger. So my number 7 is Postcards from a Living Hell by the band Red Hook. Coming in at my number 6 is the third full-length album by the band Movements, titled Ruckus. Movements, man, they just don't fucking miss. It's as simple as that. Every album that they've put out has been great, and this is no exception. I was super excited about this album coming, especially after the lineup of singles that they were releasing beforehand, and I'm talking right back to Barbed Wire Body and Cherry Thrills, which I'm kind of sad and bummed that both of those songs didn't make the cut for this album, but with all that being said, there's nothing to be worried about, because this album, as I said, is great. It's got to be the band's most diverse album, sound-wise. They have their typical stuff, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, but then they throw in sort of that new emo groove sort of sound that they've been working towards. Even some melodic ballads that, really stand out to previous songs that they've done. While I will still say it's not the band's best effort, like I said in the introduction, they just don't fucking miss. Every album that they've done has been great, no exception. They've just delivered since their debut. So my number 6 is Movement's album Ruckus. Coming in at my number 5 spot is the album Till the Wheels Fall Off by super underrated pop punk band Waster. Waster are almost single-handedly keeping the pulse of pop punk alive, healthy and flowing, and what I mean by that is, of course, there are other great pop punk bands putting out albums at the moment, and a lot of them are underrated and everything like that, but nothing hits the peaks or is hard in the truest form of pop punk, in my opinion, than what Waster are doing at the moment. Like, this album reminds me of some of my favourite albums of all time, and I genuinely mean that. I'm talking about Neck Deep, Life's Not Out to Get You, Between You and Me, Armageddon, early Blink-182 stuff, even some of their previous albums, because Waster, as I said, stuff before this have also been really great. Like what I said before with Movements in my previously mentioned spot, Waster just don't fucking miss. And for some reason, they're still so underrated. Like, normally when bands grow and they release more stuff over time, they become bigger, but somehow I'm hearing less people bring up Waster, and it's just becoming weird. It's like almost like they're not a band, and it's almost like a fucking crime that I'm hearing so little about this band. It has some of the typical fast-paced skate pop punk vibes that we've become used to with the band, but then some like legit heavier stuff. Like, I'm talking about songs like Poor Boy, but then there's also some electronic stuff, which I've said before on my channel, I'm not a big fan of like overly polluting a song with electronic stuff, but they make it fucking work on this album somehow, and I never thought I'd say that. This album, as I said, so fucking underrated, and it probably could have been higher if I was able to get my hands on a copy of this album earlier. Originally, they only released vinyls of this album, and I'm like, no, that won't fucking do, because I collect CDs. And I did what I do best. I get in contact with the record companies over Instagram or whatever, and just fucking peer pressure them into releasing a CD. So that's what they did, and I was finally able to pick up this album. But so fucking good. If you love pop punk and don't know who Waster are, check them out, because I'm guarantee they're gonna fucking blow your shitter. So my number 5 is Till the Wheels Fall Off by the band Waster. Coming in at my number 4 is the sophomore album by Olivia Rodrigo titled Guts. Now, I had this deep down suspicion that this album was going to be good, and I'm talking about like way before the fact, like before any singles or anything dropped, just when we got news that this album was coming. Yeah, I had this hunch that the album was going to be good, and it immediately became one of my most anticipated for the year. I can't put my finger exactly on why I had this hunch. I just presume, she had a great debut album with Sour. It's not perfect, but it's still really solid as a debut. But I just figured if she could iron out some of the kinks, tinker with some things that could have been improved on, she's still young and hungry enough to take it to that next step up, and she could deliver, and that's exactly what she did here. Like, before I move off the topic, like, I was so confident in this album. By this time, she had released a few singles that I heard and everything, and it was the day that the album was dropping. The first time that I listened to the album in full, normally I like to listen to the album in full a few times before going to pick it up and to see if I like it. The first time I listened to it in full was in store when it was playing over the speakers going to pick this up. I went and browsed like a few movies and music while it played. It was in JB Hi-Fi. If you're Australian, you'll know the store. And I just listened to the album in full, knowing full well that I was going to pick it up anyway. There was just something about this album that drew me in before, like, the fact, but I'm getting off topic. Anyway, Olivia really cut down on the ballads with this album, which I think was good, because it was a little bit overkill with the ballads in Sour. And don't get me wrong, there are still ballads on this album, but they're just 10 times better. Like, they just seem more layered, and there seems to be a bit more substance to them. But then there's also that fun, energized pop rock songs that she sort of became known for as well, and she managed to top herself with them also. It's clear that she's developed and matured and, learnt so much over her time writing and performing and, sort of putting out these albums. As I said, this album just really topped a solid debut being Sour, and it just goes to show, Sour wasn't a fluke. I'm sure Olivia Rodrigo is going to be around for a long time and still putting out great albums. So coming in at my number 4 is Guts by Olivia Rodrigo. Moving into my top 3 and coming in at my number 3 spot is the album This Is Why by Paramore. This is probably genuinely the best made album on this list, but I do my rankings on my personal favourites and personal taste, but if I was doing it off best made, this would be number 1. It's my pick to win the Grammy this year, but either way, I remember when this album first dropped, there were some people that didn't really like it, and I actually remember a lot of people saying, oh, this is nothing like Riot. Like, no shit, it's nothing like Riot. I know Riot is sort of the pinnacle Paramore album, and a lot of people love that album, but what made you think it was going to be anything like Riot? Like, the most recent album by Paramore that we've had to Riot is probably Brand New Eyes, and that came out in the late 2000s, if I remember right. Like, what made you think this was going to be anything like Riot? It couldn't have been the singles, because the singles This Is Why and The News and Running Out of Time, like, none of them sounded like Riot either, maybe slightly at best, but the most recent thing they probably sounded like were the self-titled album Paramore that came out in like the mid-2010s, I think. And then I remember some people defending this album and being like, oh, it is Riot, it's Riot 2.0. No, it doesn't have to be Riot. Everyone is comparing this to Riot. I don't know why, it was really fucking bugging me. But either way, at the same time, I eventually feel like a lot of people came around on it, and it really deserved people coming around on it because it's funky, it's fun, it's energetic, it's infectious, and overall just a really easy album to listen to. Flies by. I went and saw Paramore play live last month. They were fucking awesome as well. They were really good. My favourite album by Paramore is Brand New Eyes, which, like I said before, it's a pretty different vibe to what we got here. But with that being said, I wasn't a fan of the previous album before this one, After Laughter, but this seems to be like a good in-between. I really enjoyed this. I have like no complaints. My number 3, This Is Why by Paramore. Coming in at my number 2 is the album So Much for Stardust by Fall Out Boy. Now, I've said this so many times on my channel before, it is no secret that Fall Out Boy are one of my favourite bands of all time. I feel cautiously confident to say they are my favourite band of all time, but it's close between a couple. But either way, finally back with something I really enjoyed. The only Fall Out Boy album that I don't care about and don't own is Mania, which was the album previous to this one. I just think that album is genuinely bad. I have no interest on picking it up. Just thinking about it, I wish it just never happened. Sorry, I lie. Another album that I don't own by Fall Out Boy is Take This to Your Grave, just purely because I can't find a copy of it. But either way, Mania, don't like that album, as I said, previous to this one. So when So Much for Stardust was announced, I was cautiously excited, but when it dropped, I was pleasantly surprised. Don't quote me, but I think I heard Pete Wentz say that this is what the album after Folie à Deux would have sounded like if they never went on a hiatus. And I do find that kind of hard to believe because it is so different to Folie à Deux, but it is the best and most enjoyable album, in my opinion, post Folie à Deux. Now, I will be completely honest, this album is not perfect. 100% bias plays into its positioning on this ranking. But as I said, I do the rankings on my personal favourites and personal tastes. And you guys can't lie. When an all-time favourite band drops a new album that is somewhat solid, everyone caves in somewhat. Now, with that being said, don't let me sell you short on this album. It's definitely above average. Finally back with like authentic instrumentals. It seems like the band actually care. The writing of the hooks and melody are catchy as fuck, but I mean, they've always been really good at that. I'm just happy that it seems like there is a hopeful future for Fall Out Boy after Mania, because I was really thinking, wow, one of my favourite bands have dropped the ball when Mania came out, and now I just don't listen to them anymore. But Fall Out Boy, they really delivered with So Much for Stardust, and that's why it's my number 2. And here we are, finally at my number 1, my favourite album of the year 2023, One More Time by Blink-182. Now again, no secret, I've said it so many times on my channel, one of my all-time favourite bands. they were the reason why I was hesitant to say before that Fall Out Boy were my all-time favourites, but they've always been neck and neck with each other in my mind. They're both great bands, but either way, I was super surprised and stoked with how genuinely solid I found this album to be, and I wholeheartedly mean this. I believe it's in the better half of Blink's entire discography, and I really do mean that. Now, let me also say, by all means, I don't think this album is perfect. Like, there are a few moments with songs that I genuinely don't care too much for. And kind of like my number 2 album that I mentioned, So Much for Stardust by Fall Out Boy, bias 100% plays into the positioning on this list. But again, I do everything off my personal taste, personal favourites. This was my favourite album of the year. But as I said, I also think it was a genuinely good album. Now, I was a little bit worried going into this album that it was going to be kind of a gimmick, a little bit of nostalgia bait, but I genuinely feel this was a heartfelt, passion-driven project. And of course, I was happy to see the Holy trio back together, Mark, Tom, and Travis, and I was sure whatever they were going to do wasn't going to be half-assed, but I didn't want the only joy from this album being that the three of them were back together. And after the first single, Edging, by all means a fun song, catchy, it's actually grown on me a lot, but when it originally dropped, I was happy to admit it wasn't a great song. It was just purely the fact that Mark, Tom, and Travis were back together, and as I said, I was sort of worried that the hype around this album were going to be that the three of them were back together, and that was it. The album wasn't going to be the strongest. But this album was way better than I expected, and in a way kind of wanted it to be. I was happy for it to just be passable, but it was better than I could have ever imagined. I genuinely, as I said, feel like this was a solid album. Just so much fun that the band is known for. Even some badass moments, songs like Terrified and Turpentine, and just genuine. As I said, they really came together and said, let's do a fucking project we really care about. My least favourite thing about this album, wholeheartedly, is probably the cover. There are alternative covers out there, different colours, and there's one with the three of them on the front, but all of them are pretty weak in my opinion. But either way, that's probably my least favourite thing about the album. I can't wait to see them in February. I go and see them live. I forget where they're playing at, but it's in February. I can't fucking wait. Rise Against are opening for them as well, so it's going to be a fucking great show. But either way, my number 1, my favourite album of 2023, One More Time by Blink-182. So there we go, guys, through my ranking of my favourite albums from the year 2023. As I said, 22 albums that we went through there, so quite the list. But yeah, really enjoyed filming and talking about these albums again. Now, as usual, at the end of these videos, I do a quick little recap, a reminder of my list. But before I get into that, I just wanted to quickly explain something for people who might be new to these videos or maybe just forgotten, because I've had people ask this question. As I said, this ranking was a list of my favourite albums. However, the ones towards the back I spoke about quite negatively, almost like I don't like those albums at all compared to the ones at the front. But I've said this before, every album that I pick up for my collection and speak about in my videos, whether it's a top 10, a ranking, a review, I only ever pick up albums and talk about albums that I like to some extent. There are some albums in my collection that I've fallen out of love with, but at some point I liked that album more than just your average album going around. So even the ones towards the back of this list I still really enjoy, but the negatives that I'm talking about are more so explaining why it's lower compared to other ones. I still really like those albums. That might be obvious to some people, but I just thought I'd quickly explain because I've had people ask me in the comments about, a ranking of my favourites, but I'm speaking negative about one that's quite low. No, I still really like those albums. Alright, so getting into this recap, as I said, 22 to go through. My number 22 was the EP The Fear of Fear by Spiritbox. Haven't had a chance to pick that one up. My number 21 was Austin by Post Malone. My number 20 was Not Without My Ghost, The Amity Affliction. My number 19 was Alone in a Crowd by Oliver Tree. My number 18 was The Surface by Beartooth. Also haven't had a chance to pick that one up. My number 17, The Best Part About Being Human by Bearings. My number 16, Losing What We Love by Knucklepuck. My number 15 was Blink and You'll Miss It by Kenny Hoopla. I'm not sure if there'll ever be a physical release of that album or EP. Number 14, Calling the Dogs by Citizen. Number 13 was Intellectual Property, Waterparks. My number 12, Sunburn, Dominic Fike. Oh, gotta pick up the rest. My number 11, But Here We Are, Foo Fighters. My number 10, Still Love, Teenage Wrist. Number 9, The Jaws of Life, Pierce of Ale. Number 8, Suicide and Sunshine, Trophy Eyes. Number 7, Postcards from a Living Hell, Red Hook. My number 6, Ruckus by the band Movements. My top 5 were Till the Wheels Fall Off, Waster. 4, Guts by Olivia Rodrigo. My number 3, This Is Why by Paramore. Number 2, Fall Out Boy, So Much for Stardust. I forgot to say as well, I saw them at Good Things Festival this past month as well. They were so fucking good. As I said, bias again because they're one of my all-time favorite bands, but their whole set, it was like two songs off each album, and they weren't even like always the most popular ones. There was some deep cuts like Bang the Doll Drums and like, oh fuck, it was crazy. And my number 1, One More Time, Blink-182. Alright, I'm sure this video has gone long enough, so I'm going to wrap it up there. Let me know some of your favourite albums in the comments below. If you have any thoughts on the albums that I featured in today's video, let me know as well, guys. And I'll see you for another video soon. Peace.